Hello there, I'm Louis from Spitfire Audio, and in this video I'm going to break down a little demo I've written that for the most part uses our brilliant Percussion Swarm library. The library contains a comprehensive collection of beautiful evolutions, rich undulating textures and swells, as well as single hits both with tuned and untuned percussion. Including a generous 16 signals to choose from and mix, the library also has 30 warped pads and rhythmic textures to offer. Percussion Swarm was recorded in the hall at Air Studios and features gorgeous performances from some of the world's finest percussionists, Paul Clavis, Frank Ricotti and Gary Kettle, who have also contributed on our other percussion libraries, as well as being renowned for their substantial work on film scores. With a plethora of sounds ranging in sparsity and density, as well as a variety of performance techniques recorded on an impressive collection of instruments, Percussion Swarm isn't a library you want to miss out on. Breathing life into your piece with these wonderful performances, as well as being an all-round fun library to experience. It goes without saying, our very own Paul Thompson has done an extensive walkthrough on the library, so if you want to familiarise yourself with all of the remarkable sounds Percussion Swarm has to offer, then I recommend you check out his walkthrough, which will be linked in the description. On to the demo. I've titled it Kodama, and for any Studio Ghibli fans out there, you might recognise that as a reference to the little tree spirits seen in the film Princess Mononoke, which I highly recommend you watch if you haven't seen it. What's curious about these little creatures is that when they roam the forest, they shake their heads, producing these wonderful, natural rattling sounds. And when I was first playing with some of the sounds in the library, that's what I was reminded of, serving as great inspiration for the piece. And thinking about it, for me, that's really what Percussion Swarm is. A forest teeming with all sorts of textures, patterns and atmospheres, chock full of sounds that bring nothing but life and wonder into your music. So for this piece, I've relied heavily on Percussion Swarm to generate this forward momentum and make the music sound alive. I've also incorporated two other libraries outside of Percussion Swarm in this piece, one of those being Kepler Orchestra. To give a brief description on Kepler Orchestra, it's a library which creates a variety of exciting rhythms and atmospheres somewhat similar to our Percussion Swarm. However, it uses the orchestra to evoke this sense of movement, which in all honesty is perfect to use with Percussion Swarm, as well as the other Swarm libraries as they gel together effortlessly. The other library I'm adding to the sound palette is our Solo Strings library, being used to create intimate string passages and melodies throughout. Let's take a listen. Now looking at the library, you're presented with all the instruments at its disposal, with your warp sounds and further signals and mixes in the respective folders there. Looking at my session, you can see I've organised the sounds with the more swarm-like sounds in this grouping here. Then we've got our long sounds and some of our shorts, both tuned and untuned, as well as the Kepler Orchestra and Solo Strings libraries there at the bottom. So let's start with the swarms. I've used these to create this wonderful textural space, which really helps open up the piece. Right at the beginning, I'm using the anklungs here, and they sound very reminiscent of the Kodama from Princess Mononoke, which I mentioned earlier. With a bit of added tape delay and reverb on the buses here, we're able to create depth even from a relatively reserved sound such as this one. We've also got a chimes and phones patch at the beginning here, providing a harmony with the swarmed bows articulation. So we're just moving between a B5 and E major here, and as we get to about halfway through the piece, the harmony changes slightly, adding a D5 between our B and E chords. If I just zoom out a little bit, just there. Using these chords without a note in the middle to determine whether it's major or minor gives us a nice loose tonality to play with, giving the piece an air of mystery which relates to this idea of this living forest I pictured when writing it. I particularly like how these chords are phrased and how they continuously flow into one another and are further complemented by the sound of the swarmed bows articulation. A little while after, we've got these three tracks at the top here, introducing themselves, being the xylophones, the tongue drum and the kalimba. Some of these are panned quite drastically to further add to the depth and keep this sense of momentum present from all sides in the stereo field. So what I'll do is solo these three out and play them together so you can hear how they interact with each other. I absolutely love that deep tone of the kalimba being played with sticks, and it's a super unique sound. I really like how these elements respond with each other so naturally, and that sentiment extends outside the instruments in the Percussion Swarm library as well. It was important for me to have these instruments respond and interact with Kepler Orchestra and the solo strings lines that are introduced, not only to make the piece gel together, but also to make it feel alive and have all of these elements flow together naturally. You can hear for yourself how great these swarm sound performances are, and it's been great having the ability to have this sense of movement in percussion without the music necessarily being an adrenaline-fueled action cue. Like with the changes in the chimes and phones halfway through, these elements also die down a little during the second half, and you can see if I bring the automation up, I've automated the volume there just as the second half's introduced, before reintroducing these parts with our string melody. I've also got a track here using the pantam, playing a couple of notes in our first half with the swarmed fingers articulation. The pantam creates these lovely little responses to our cello in the first section, with these gorgeous swells ringing out. Now during the second half, we have the space to introduce a marimba, aiding the chimes and phones harmony, also using the swarmed bows articulation. Another really gorgeous example of a swarm sound that's more on the melodic harmonic side than rhythmical. What's interesting as well is I've decided to use the close valve signal for most of the swarms to retain that intimacy and sense of closeness, while adding additional reverb to give it that depth, as I mentioned before. And with all of these moving parts, especially with additional panning, you really start to just feel this sense of movement. The last sound in this section is a little handbell carousel playing this short twirl effect. You can hear I've automated the panning so the sound moves past you, bringing the piece to a close, with added delay on bus 2 to lengthen out the tail. On top of the added reverb, it's made the sound really echoey, almost dreamlike. Looking at more of our long sounds now, I've used a couple of warped patches here. Firstly, I used warp sound number 7, titled Proto-Laurasia, providing a drone in our first section, before moving on to more of a harmonic roll in the second half. You can hear the sound has a really lovely airy quality to it. We also have another warped patch, this time number 27, titled Amazonia, in these two tracks here. First introduced at the start of our second half using the EQ, chorus and delay found within the engine, and the second of these tracks providing a direct response to the solo violin's melody at the end of the track before we close. I really love how this patch sings out. It's really convenient in providing emotion to your music. You can see I've used a single band EQ here, acting as a low pass filter, but in retrospect I could have just automated the low pass filter in the UI, in these warped patches here, to create the same effect. As well as these warped tracks, we've also got the tongue drum using the Super Ball cloud articulation, panned apart between two tracks, giving us some added texture in our second half. What an incredibly useful sound. You can feel the sense of movement in that patch alone. Moving on to the shorts, we've got a section for tuned percussion. Now here I'm using shorts in our glass glockenspiel and xylophone, and you can see that I've doubled the tracks and panned them apart as well, with one of the tracks being an octave higher than the other. I've also automated the volume on these tracks, especially on the higher ones, to help add to the momentum in growing sections of the music. The glass glockenspiels play a little sequence which sounds like this. A nice little moment just before we move into the second half with our main string melody. If we open the piano roll, you can see the sequence is built up using triplets, and the same goes for our xylophones as well. Let's have a listen to these xylophones which join us in the second half. You've got a nice warm natural tone on these. I really like how they sound. And you may have also noticed I've got these tracks on bus 3, which uses another tape delay just to add some extra patterns. I always enjoy experimenting with a simple delay just to see how it morphs the rhythms and passages I've created with the percussion. You might be wondering why I've decided to put the delays on buses instead of directly on the tracks themselves. And if we jump to the bottom, you can see that I've got a grouping here for our delay buses. So I've created auxiliary tracks for both delays, and that's purely so I can automate the feedback and mainly just turn it off at the end so the piece doesn't run on. Now, taking a look at our untuned shorts, here lies the driving force and pulse for our piece. Starting at the bottom, we have a track with oodoos, also opening the piece, playing a couple of notes at the start of each bar. And this is later backed up by another warped patch, number 26, also known as Nova Pangea, giving the oodoos a little bit more oomph as we layer the piece up. As well as these two tracks providing a pulse for our music, we have these three tracks here, two of which consisting of romanas and the other one consisting of bartas. Now our first track plays a nice even pulse sounding like this. While the other romanas and bartas have a little call and response between each other. You'll see some of these tracks have a little break as our second section begins, and if we look at the udus and warped patch, you'll see that they're playing every 2 bars now during this part. The other 3 tracks we need to touch on all use delay effects we've put on buses 2 and 3. So the second track of bartas creates a really nice build at transitional moments in the piece, as well as adding a little rhythm of its own during the second section. I really like how sections flow into one another, and Percussion Swarm helps pull off these transitions smoothly and keeps the piece moving. Our other 2 tracks here are another set of udus and some damarus, making full use of the delay to add extra rhythms. I'll give all of this another play at the end so you can hear how all of these elements contribute and help build the piece. Now, moving on to the other libraries I've used, we're looking at the second half here, where I've introduced the Kepler Orchestra. Using the high strings grid, basses momentum grid, and our woodwind grid to add extra orchestral rhythms. And then last but not least is our solo strings, providing intimate melodies and counter melodies. Here I'm using the total performance patch for both the violin and cello, using them separately as melody lines in our first section, and then for the main melody in our second half, I have both of these loaded up as a single instance. These are really intuitive legato patches, allowing for incredibly realistic transitions between notes. Let's give the piece a final listen all together, keeping an ear out for the solo strings amongst the percussion, and how these elements interact with each other. And that wraps it up nicely. I really appreciate you for watching, and I hope this has given you some ideas of how to use Percussion Swarm and how to create momentum using percussion. Thanks for listening to the piece, and I hope you're enjoying using the amazing sounds in our Percussion Swarm library. As always, I'd love to hear how you've used the library and ways you've been able to use these sounds to give your music that driving power and life, so do let us know in the comments below. Thanks again, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.